I've been married to Jacob for almost 5 years now, and the transition into married life has been complicated, to say the least. We've had our fair share of struggles, but nothing quite prepared me for the challenges we'd face with his family. While Jacob and I have built a strong, supportive partnership, his family, especially his mother, whom I'll refer to as Mill, has caused more stress than I ever imagined. This has led to a series of confrontations that have put a strain on our marriage, and recently, it has gotten to a point where I had to stand my ground. Jacob and I met when we were both in our mid-20s. He's kind, ambitious, and fiercely protective, which drew me to him. Our relationship moved relatively quickly, and soon we were living together, planning our future. A few years into our relationship, we decided to marry. It felt like the natural progression. We both had big dreams for our lives, but we were also deeply in love. We had dreams of building a home, having children, and growing old together. When we started looking for houses, we were on the same page about what we wanted. Something comfortable, spacious, and most importantly, something we could both be proud of. I wasn't interested in a huge mansion, but I wanted enough space where we could grow into it, where we wouldn't feel cramped. Jacob and I eventually found a beautiful house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't too far from the city center, but it was quiet and peaceful, just perfect for us. The only thing that made me feel uneasy was the idea of showing it off to his family, particularly his mother. Mill and I have never had the best relationship, to put it mildly. From the moment I married Jacob, I could sense that she had trouble accepting me. I had been warned about her by Jacob and his friends. She was controlling, possessive, and incredibly judgmental of anyone who wasn't in her inner circle. But at the time, I thought, how bad could it really be? After all, how many people had a perfect relationship with their in-laws? Surely I could navigate this, right? When we moved into the new house, I kept my distance from Mill. I figured the less interaction we had, the better. However, she wasn't one to stay out of the picture. I had a feeling that she would try to insert herself into our lives in one way or another. What I didn't expect was the level of entitlement and manipulation she would use to get her way. It started small. Mill would call and ask how we were settling in, always with a thinly veiled critique of how we were living. Was the house too big for just the two of us? Shouldn't we think about downsizing to something more practical? At first, I brushed it off. But the comments started to grow more frequent, more pointed, and more invasive. I was especially sensitive to her comments because Jacob and I had been trying to have children for a while with no success. I had been diagnosed with infertility a few years into our marriage. We tried everything from fertility treatments to natural remedies, but nothing worked. It was an incredibly emotional experience for both of us. While Jacob had always been supportive and told me he loved me regardless of whether we could have children or not, I could tell it hurt him too. The idea of being childless wasn't exactly part of the plan we had envisioned. But we came to terms with it together. We built the life without children, a life that we were happy with, even though the longing was always there. One day, Mill's casual question about our new house struck a nerve. She asked me, almost offhandedly, "How does it feel to live in such a big house when it's just the two of you?" Her tone was almost mocking, as if suggesting we didn't deserve such a large space. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. I knew what she was implying. I knew she was referring to our childlessness, and it stung. She knew about my struggles, about how Jacob and I had come to terms with the idea of not having kids. And yet, there she was, casually bringing it up as though it was something trivial. I gave a tight-lipped smile and changed the subject, but the discomfort lingered. Jacob had known about my infertility issues since the beginning of our relationship, and he had always been a rock. He never once pressured me about it. He even reassured me repeatedly that our life was complete as it was. But Mill, on the other hand, had a different view. In her mind, a family wasn't complete without children. She had 3 of her own, and she seemed to believe that our home should somehow be filled with children too. Then, out of nowhere, Mill dropped a bombshell on me. She called one afternoon and casually mentioned that my sister-in-law, who I'll refer to as Sil, was pregnant. My initial reaction was shock, especially since I knew Sil already had 5 children. I couldn't help but think, how could this happen? Sil's husband, as far as I knew, was completely lazy, irresponsible, and downright irresponsible when it came to parenting and financial matters. Jacob had told me that Sil's husband didn't work, didn't help around the house, and had little to no regard for their financial situation. I was stunned by the news of Sil's pregnancy. How is it possible that this man, who seemed to do nothing but play video games and avoid his responsibilities, had impregnated Sil once again? I wasn't angry at Sil for wanting more children. It was her life, and she could make her own choices, but I couldn't understand how she continued to enable her partner's behavior. Mill went on to tell me that Sil was struggling financially, and with another baby on the way, it would be even harder for her to make ends meet. I sympathized with her, but then Mill made a shocking demand. She suggested that Jacob and I should give up our house so Sil and her family could move in with us. I was floored. She told me, in no uncertain terms, that since we didn't have children and the house was too large for a childless couple, it would make sense for us to downsize and let Sil and her family move into our place. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. She didn't even ask us if we were okay with it. She just assumed that we would comply with her demands. At this point, I knew I had to stand my ground. I told her that this was our house, something Jacob and I had worked hard for, and I wasn't going to let anyone, especially not Sil and her irresponsible husband, take it over. I asked her if she was joking, but she was serious. She insisted that Jacob had agreed to it, that he had already given his blessing. Now, this was where things took an even stranger turn. I knew Jacob better than anyone, and I was certain that he had not agreed to this. We had always shared everything with each other, so why would he suddenly agree to let Sil and her family move in without even consulting me? I asked Mill point blank if she had spoken to Jacob about this, and she said, "Of course, I've already talked to him, and he's fine with it," but I knew that this was a lie. Jacob would never agree to something so ridiculous without consulting me first. I was furious. I told Mill that if Jacob had truly agreed to this, he would have told me, and I needed to talk to him before making any decisions. But she wouldn't have it. She insisted that since the house belonged to both of us, it was a joint decision. I disagreed. If we were going to make any changes to our home, it needed to be a decision we both made together. To make matters worse, Mill went on to tell me that if I agreed to let Sil and her family move in, all of our past issues, her constant criticism, her undermining of me as a wife, and all the times she'd disrespected me, would be forgotten. As if this was some kind of bargain. I was livid. I told her that if she truly thought we should allow Sil's family to move in, then she could help with the mortgage and bills. After all, if we were going to take on the financial burden of supporting Sil's entire family, she should contribute. Mill's response was nothing short of enraged. She yelled at me for daring to suggest she should pay our mortgage. But I wasn't backing down. If Mill was going to impose her demands on us, then she needed to understand that we weren't just going to roll over. This was our home, our life, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into doing something I didn't want to do. I told her in no uncertain terms that if Sil's family wanted to move in, they could help with the mortgage. Otherwise, they were not welcome in our home. Mill's outrage only escalated. She screamed at me, calling me selfish, greedy, and ungrateful. But I had had enough. After the heated phone call with Mill, I spent the next few days in a state of disbelief, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. Her entitlement, the way she expected us to simply give up our home for Sil and her chaotic family, it was overwhelming. To be honest, I had always known that Mill could be a bit overbearing, but I never imagined she would cross such a boundary. It was one thing to express concerns or make judgments. It was entirely another to make such an audacious demand. Jacob had always been supportive of me, especially when it came to handling his family. He knew how complicated things were with Mill, but I was still blindsided by her behavior. We had always maintained a distance from his family, and I thought we were doing a good job keeping things balanced. But this was different. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of anger and betrayal. Mill had not only overstepped, but she had lied to me about Jacob's involvement. I knew for a fact that he would have never agreed to let Sil and her family move in without consulting me first. And yet Mill had made it sound like it was a done deal. As if our opinions didn't even matter. My frustration grew with every passing hour. I tried not to let it consume me, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this situation wasn't just about a house. It was about boundaries, respect, and power dynamics within our marriage. How had Mill gotten to the point where she felt she could dictate such a huge decision? Was Jacob's silence on the matter a sign that he was complacent in her manipulation, or was he simply unaware of how far she had gone? I knew I needed to talk to Jacob about it, but I didn't want to approach him in a way that might add more tension. He had just returned from a business trip, and I knew he was already exhausted. But this was important. So, I decided to wait for the right moment to bring it up. When Jacob finally came home, I immediately sat him down. I knew I had to address the situation head-on, even if it made him uncomfortable. I started by telling him about the phone call with Mill, explaining how she had suggested that Sil and her family move in with us. I detailed the entire conversation, from Mill's initial comments about her house being too big for just the two of us, to her outrageous request that we give up our home to accommodate Sil's growing family. I could see the shock on Jacob's face as I spoke, and it pained me to realize that he had no idea this was coming. He sat there for a moment, clearly trying to process everything I had just told him. His face shifted between confusion, disbelief, and then anger. He shook his head, muttering that he couldn't believe his mother had taken things this far. He assured me that he had not given her any kind of approval to make such a request. As it turned out, Mill had lied about speaking to him. Jacob had no knowledge of her intentions and had never agreed to let Syl and her family move in. I could feel a small sense of relief wash over me, but I also knew that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Jacob and I needed to get on the same page, and we needed to make it clear to his family that this type of behavior would no longer be tolerated. Jacob's reaction to Mill's actions was a mixture of frustration and disbelief. He was upset, not just because his mother had lied to me, but because it was becoming clear to him that Mill had been trying to manipulate him for years. The thought of her meddling in our lives so blatantly was more than he could stomach. I firmly told Jacob that I couldn't handle his family treating me like this anymore. If this kind of behavior continued, it was going to tear us apart. We were a team, and we needed to act like one. Jacob agreed, and I could see the resolve in his eyes. He knew this was a serious issue, and it was time for him to take control. Without wasting any more time, Jacob called Mill. I stood by, watching the conversation unfold, half dreading what would come next. When Mill answered, Jacob didn't waste any time. He immediately confronted her about the lie she had told, asking her why she hadn't been truthful about the conversation they had supposedly had. Mill, who usually tried to maintain her air of authority, faltered for a moment. At first, she tried to backpedal, saying that she hadn't lied exactly. She justified her actions by saying that she had assumed Jacob would have no problem with Syl moving in, and she took matters into her own hands. She even claimed that Jacob and Syl were so close that he would obviously want to help her by allowing her family to stay with us. I could feel my blood boil as I listened to Mill's manipulative rhetoric. The way she casually dismissed our boundaries, the way she assumed she could speak for Jacob, it was infuriating. But Jacob remained calm. He asked her, point blank, why she thought she could make decisions about her home without consulting him first. He reminded her that this was our house, and he had the right to say no to any request that involved both of us. Mill's response was predictable. She started to raise her voice, telling Jacob that Syl really needed help and that it was the right thing to do. She went on to say that since I was childless anyway, it would make perfect sense for us to take care of Syl's children. The implication, of course, was that I would somehow feel fulfilled by caring for them. My stomach churned at her words. It was as if she was trying to guilt-trip both of us into doing what she wanted. But Jacob's reaction surprised me. For the first time, I saw him truly stand up to her. He snapped at her, telling her that she had no right to be so insensitive about my infertility. He told her that it was not her place to use my personal pain as leverage to get what she wanted. I could tell Mill wasn't prepared for this level of confrontation. She tried to backtrack, but Jacob wasn't having it. He told her that this wasn't about helping Syl, it was about boundaries. He was done allowing his family to manipulate us, and he made it clear that anyone who disrespected me would be cut off from our lives. I couldn't have been prouder of Jacob in that moment. After years of tiptoeing around his family, he had finally found his voice. He told Mill that if she couldn't respect our boundaries, then they didn't have a place in our lives. He even told her that he no longer wanted any contact with her or Syl, effectively cutting ties with his mother and sister. Mill was stunned. She tried to beg Jacob to reconsider, but he was resolute. He ended the call, and just like that, it was over. The fallout wasn't immediate, but it didn't take long for the storm to brew. Within hours, Syl called me furious. She didn't bother to ask if I was okay. Instead, she launched into a tirade, accusing me of trying to break up the family and selfishly refusing to help her out. She called me a gold digger, claiming that I only cared about money. Her words stung, but I refused to let them get to me. I had had enough of her and her lazy, entitled husband. I shot back, telling Syl that if she wanted to see a real gold digger, she should take a long, hard look at her own partner, who did nothing to contribute to their household. Syl was taken aback by my bluntness, and for a moment, she was silent. I knew I had hit a nerve. I then calmly told Syl that if she and her husband wanted to live in our house, they would need to contribute to the mortgage and bills. Otherwise, they could find somewhere else to live. She huffed and muttered about how unreasonable I was, but I wasn't backing down. I had already made up my mind, and there was no changing it. As the days passed, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I felt like I had regained control over my life. I wasn't going to be bullied into sacrificing our home and our happiness for the sake of Syl and her irresponsible family. And Jacob had finally seen the truth about how toxic his family could be. But even though things seemed to have calmed down, I knew this wasn't over. I had a feeling Mill and Sil wouldn't just accept defeat and walk away quietly. And I was right. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.